welcome on behalf of David, Dean David Springer. He could not be with us today because of a scheduling conflict. He sends his regards. And so what I'll do right now is just a reminder of the title, and then we'll go straight into the introductions and from there to the presentation, okay? And so time permitting, we may take some questions and answers, but given the size of the audience that's in the gallery, it may be kind of tough. But if there's any question that you may have, a pressing question, go ahead and put it in the chat. And if we have time, we'll reflect back on it. And we'll just go with the flow. We'll go with the flow. Sometimes you have a set plan and that plan doesn't go that way. So we're flexible, adaptable as we are social workers. So again, my name's Keith Mathis, and again, just welcoming you. You're here for this Native American Heritage virtual event, and I'll get right to it and have the speakers. We have 4 great dynamic individuals with us here today. We just thank them for gracing us with their presence. And what we'll do right now is have them to just give a brief introduction as to who they are and a little bit of their background. So without hesitation, we can just start with Shana King.
Dosha, everybody. It's Madaka Behobawiya, Shami Tadatse Rikra, and Mandan Hadatsana Rikra, sorry. And I just said hello. My name is Holy Owl Woman. My English given name is Shana King, and I am Mandan Hadatsana Rikra from Fort Berthold, North Dakota. I am a person who is aged out of foster care and a birth parent who has been a part of a system and had her children placed in foster care and successfully reunified. I am a parent mentor at the Equal Law Center, and I just help do peer-to-peer support for families that are impacted by ICWA. I apologize, I'm a little bit sick, so my voice is very off today.
Okay. You can just do round robin. Who's next? Shannon?
Sure, thank you. I'm excited to be here today. My name is Shannon Smith, and I'm the director at the ICWA Law Center. We are located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We do provide statewide services across Minnesota and also in tribal courts. And then we also work nationally on trainings and policy involving the Indian Child Welfare Act. I've been at the ICWA Law Center for about 25 years and feel very fortunate to be able to do the work that I do every day. Prior to going to law school, my background was in social work. I worked as a school social worker for a period of time, but I'm happy to be here today and look forward to a conversation that is incredibly important. So I appreciate being able to be a part of this, and thank you for bringing us all together.
I'll jump in. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Huesca. I am a Mexican Indigenous man. I currently live in San Diego, California, and I am the executive director of Paternal Opportunity Programs and Services, which is an organization focused on fathers. I'm also a board member of the ICWA Law Center, previous tribal administrator, and currently a lobbyist for 3 federally recognized tribes here in San Diego County. Very active in ICWA and understanding ICWA, and trying to also make sure that both courts as well as social workers are actually following ICWA the way that should be implemented. And I am all through. I don't know who's next.
Hi, thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. On Betu Washte, Chante na pe wash, Chante na pe wachuzami, Oyate awawi chaka wea. Good day. I greet you with a warm heart and a good handshake. My name is Melita Rank. My native name, my Dakota name, is Woman Called Upon to Help Her People. I am from the Crow Creek Nation, which is located in central South Dakota. I've been a lifelong social worker that I am very passionate about. And not only that, I am also fortunate to be an alumni from FSU way back in the day. So thank you for having me today.
All righty, and thank you all for those introductions, and we'll learn more about them. But we're going to get straight into the presentation today, and it's somewhat set up like a discussion, a courageous conversation. How brilliant! What an idea! And it's a part of a speaker series that was birthed by Naomi Melina and Paige Cubic. They talked about it and brought the idea to me, and I said, "Perfect, let's do it." We look for some sort of speaker series. So here we are today having courageous conversations. Again, if you have a question, make sure you type it into the chat. Time permitting, we'll get to as many as we can. We're going to go ahead and get started. And one of my first questions, and I just ask Shana to lead us off, is to, if you would, just share with us, before we get into some of the deep dive into a whole lot of other things, if you would share with us some of the contemporary issues that we all should be aware of, that we may not know about, that are occurring in Native American and Indigenous communities and families. What are some of those pressing issues? Shana.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said Shannon. So can you repeat the question? I'm
Well,
sorry.
what are some of the contemporary issues? Like if I were a social worker and I want to engage and I just really want to know from the outside looking in and don't know much, what are some issues, or I would say key cultural considerations that I should know about or take into that interaction?
I think first and foremost, it's important to understand that that our identity is culturally based. And so in order to understand that is to understand some of the historical and generational traumas that Indigenous people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, to kind of understand where that family's coming from. I talk a lot when I share my story about how I didn't really understand or even know the history of my people until I went to college. And I can trace history and all the events through history down my family timeline. And that definitely impacted who I am as a person and how I grew up and how I played my life out as an adult. And having to understand, I think it hit me kind of at like a ton of bricks that, it wasn't that my mom didn't love me, it's just that she didn't know how to love me because she didn't know how to be a mom. And I don't think that that's very unique to my family. I think that's something that is kind of something that all Indigenous families have to deal with just because of what has happened with the adoption era and boarding schools and just removal from our homelands. So I think that's really important to understand that historical aspect and kind of meet the people where they are at with that in life, not just where they are at when it comes to addiction or homelessness or mental health issues, but also meeting them at where they stand in this country historically. And why are we where we are, right? And then I also think it's important to understand that the system that we're stuck in isn't very Indigenous friendly. It's not very culturally friendly. So they're not going to recognize even my family systems. Like I don't think a case plan recognizes that my cousins are my brothers and sisters. And in my language in Hidatsa, we don't have like Hidatsa words for aunties and uncles because they were just our moms and dads and our grandma and grandpas. And I think that's really important to see that we are now in this system that doesn't even recognize us and our ways and our family, just our family structure. So that's really important to understand, because I think we are really, at least in my tribe and in my family, my cousins are like my sisters. And I talk to them all the time. So when we talk about sibling visitation and all that stuff, it's very different. Um, so I think that's important. I think also we need to understand that our culture is a part of our identity, and that was almost stolen from us. So in order to keep that intact is super important. And there's huge ways that we can, I know I could talk about this forever, but that we can think about that as social workers, and how to think outside of the box to keep that intact for families. And I know for me, I can just give an example. When my son and my daughter were placed in foster care, one of the places that we were able to have visitation at was at powwows. And that meant a lot to me. And I know it meant, a lot for my kids, and, just keeping that identity in their life. So I think I will stop there and pass it to someone else.
Michael, would you like to add to what Shana just spoke about?
Sure, I wasn't fast enough. I was just getting ready to jump in there. First, I want to give a brief comment about, I'm afraid I'm really close to the camera. I just had eye surgery, so I'm still focusing. So if anybody chats or raises their hand, I don't see you, and I'm not ignoring you, but I really still don't see people yet completely. That said, I agree completely with Shana, and as a administrator working in a tribe with the tribe as the tribal administrator, which it's such an incredibly heavy role, because I have a lot to do with policies and tribal laws, and even when children are removed from homes, I have the responsibility to inform the tribal council and the government of our position. Is this a tribal member? Is this a tribal member that we recognize, and are we able and willing to go to court for this child? That said, sorry, I've got a cat that just wants to be in front of me here. The caveats of working from home. So that said, what I find as sometimes a challenge is recognizing social workers are coming on to reservations, and they're not invited, right? They're coming on oftentimes because somebody has surveilled and has found something to be wrong with a family or a child. And so the fact that social workers are coming onto tribal land, or trying to come onto tribal land, there's certain privilege that I see some workers think that they have just because they work for the county, or they have a badge, or they have a role, right? That they feel overstepped, or they sometimes seem like they feel they just have this privilege and this right. When coming onto tribal lands, going back to what Shana said around trauma and understanding how Indigenous people feel about government and government intervention, I think is so important. And trying to think outside of the box, what does that look like? It goes back to the principles of ICWA to me, active efforts. It's really about figuring it out. How do I make this work? How am I here to help support? How am I here to give an active way of getting involved, and being respectful for the culture of the family, where the family is, as Shana said, etc. So I'll pass it over to you, Shannon.
You're muted, Shannon. You can go ahead. Thank you, Chepa.
Oh, thank you for that. While Shannon's working on getting off of mute, I also wanted to just build upon both Michael and Shannon's comments, where when we're talking about some of those cultural considerations, and as I listen and I hear, it's also knowing that each of our tribal nations has those unique cultural considerations that I may learn about Mandan the three affiliated, Mandan, Arikara, Hidatsa. I got to make sure I get that right. If I don't, please correct me, because I always say three affiliated, that they definitely have some different practices than what we would have in Hunkpati. So really understanding and recognizing that, and knowing that part of that as well is when we talk about family systems and family structure, you had heard that being mentioned that we may not have some words for certain relationships. While we may not also have words, we also have a unique cultural consideration where we're able to make relatives. And those relatives are just as important in that person's life somewhere along the way by relationships, standard westernized relationships. I may have a best friend of mine who my children will refer to as their aunt or their grandma, depending on where that is. So also when I think about this in terms of being a social worker that is able to have the opportunity to work for families, knowing that I should also ask, who are some of your, and what we call it in our language is hunka, because hunka means I can make a relative. And that relative relationship of a hunka is much stronger than a blood relationship for us because it's somebody that I chose. And so really having some of those understandings of what those systems look like too. But I really want to just reinforce from that key cultural considerations is each tribe has their uniquenesses, and having an understanding and learning about those is something important.
Yeah, I'm off mute. So sorry about that. This is a little bit different because I absolutely appreciate all of the answers. And so just something that's been on my mind a lot, and I will blame attorneys for this. One of the things that I think is really dangerous in child protection, child welfare, and social workers is this idea of best interests. And why I say that is I think that we all truly want what is best, but I think oftentimes that gives kind of a lens of bias, right? Because we are forced in a system, forced in the courtroom to say, we believe this is best for the child, and we believe this is best for the family. And I think historically talking, about, and taking into consideration what everyone else has said, that sometimes that gives us kind of a way to mask bias and gives us a way to create the sense that we know what is best for other families, that we know what is best for other cultures, that somehow we have this sense of knowing that I think oftentimes can be incredibly dangerous. And I think as we think about that, and attorneys force us, right? I use that language in the courtroom. So I don't want to say that I understand where it comes from, but I think it is really important as we're thinking about kind of families and individuals, and we're looking at what does their cultural lens, what does their identity mean, and how do they inform what is best for their family, and how do they inform what is best for their children. And it's not this idea that best, and kind of some historical things that I think about where this has become incredibly dangerous is education, right? In many cultures, and certainly we know now, there's an apology on October 25th from President Biden about how horrific boarding school era and how horrific that education was. That was all premised and made possible because people were saying it was best to educate the Indian out of the child. It was best to take their culture. It was best to make sure they didn't speak their language. It was best to make sure they did not have connections to home. It was best to make sure they didn't have connections to their spiritual practice. It was best that they didn't even have connections to their siblings, because that would bring a sense of family. And I think that is incredibly dangerous. And oftentimes we still do that in different systems. We say we justify it because we're saying it's best. I think that's also true in regards to adoption, how adoption was used purposely to take children away from their family to try to culture or socialize or trying to put them in a better place. And so I think as all of these different kind of ideas, I think culture is healing, culture is is identity. And if we somehow try to justify actions because we believe that it's in the best interest without understanding what that means for a child, what that means for a family, I think we enter into like this really dangerous place that the law sometimes forces us to use that language. But I think it's really important that we're very aware of what we're saying and how that may be perceived.
Awesome. Thank you. And there were a couple of points that really resonated with me when you talked about family structure. That's important that we understand when you're working with Native American, Indigenous persons and their families, that we understand what family means. And you all gave a great definition in defining family structure based on your heritage, which is very important for us. And also, Chepa brought up the point that like all cultures, we're not a monolithic culture. You know, there are subcultures within cultures. So do your homework. So my next question is, what can we as social workers do based on those cultural considerations? What are some of the best practices or ways to engage someone? Let's say I'm a social worker out there in the field, and I have one of you as one of my clients. What's the best way to engage? What are some of the things I need to do prior to meeting you and having that interaction? How do I prepare?
I can start just briefly. I mean, I think one of the most important things is showing up and being present, and then listening, and showing up in the community, right? Like if you want to, for the families that we work with, just an example, we're located in a building that is owned by the White Earth Nation. We're in an urban Minneapolis area, but we have the connection to the community. In a sense, because of where we're at. So I think showing up to places that are meaningful to the community or meaningful to the family, and then listening. And I think it's incredibly important to truly listen for all the reasons, right, that were talked about in regards to family structure, that there's uniqueness and there are things that absolutely matter, and those connections to that family are real. And so it's really important to understand and listen to, what's making the family work, right? Like who are the people that they go to? Is it grandma? Is it auntie? Is it, a neighbor, whoever it is in the community? But I think showing up and being present in a real way, that authenticity, I think ultimately shows through and goes a long ways, because there's so much distrust of systems. And so people see through that right away, like the community, if you're not showing up in a good way and, and being present.
I'll jump in and say that I completely agree. And I think, it's important, a couple things. One, it's important to have allyship with the community, right? And to really be able to work with the community so that you're invited to be present, so that you're in a space that is, as Shannon said, that is recognized and respected by the community. Relationships are so important. And so not just the relationship with you and the family, but the relationship with you and the community. Again, knowing that historically, government agencies are not trusted, not wanted. Intervention has always been harmful, recognizing what the trauma has been, and then looking at that and recognizing, okay, well, how do I align myself with supporting allies, with allies in the community, with people that are able to walk me through or walk with me in this. And then I think being transparent, recognizing and connecting with empathy and understanding. And even when you don't understand, asking to get clarity and seeking to learn. I find that often very helpful with families, is when you're able to say, I don't understand this. Can you help me? I really want to understand this. And I think that would be important. I do want to say, though, it is so important to understand why ICWA exists to begin with. And I'm going specifically to ICWA because I know often I hear people in the community say, well, ICWA should be for every child. But I think we need to, and I would agree, there are elements within ICWA that would, if they were applied to every child, that would be amazing, right? And we would have different outcomes. ICWA is the gold standard. But we need to honor the fact that ICWA is a part of a political treaty with the people. It is a sovereign right of Native people to have ICWA. And so it's not something that we can just say as a Hispanic or as a Mexican American to say that Mexicans should have this right as well. We can say that, but the truth is that there's sovereignty that's involved. It's really about the political treaties that were signed. And that's what we honor when we are honoring ICWA. And I think that's an important piece to understand, because a lot of times I hear folks say, a lot of folks who don't apply ICWA say often, well, we should be applying this for everybody. And I hear social workers that struggle with this, and sometimes they don't recognize that they have a bias when it comes to implementation of ICWA, and even judges that don't implement ICWA because of their own bias with that. So I just wanted to mention that piece as well.
And Keith, and I'm going to add a couple things that, and again, agree with my fellow panelist with a lot of what they're saying, so I'm not going to repeat that, but a couple things that I just wanted to bring forward is, as Indigenous people, we are not that far removed from some of those adversities that have happened. You've heard my colleague Shannon talk about the recent apology from President Biden with the boarding school. The boarding school, as you read some of that, may have started a long time ago, but I think for myself, I'm just 2 generations from my great-grandfather who had to change his name. So we are not that far removed from a lot of these traumas that have been here within us as Indigenous people. And to build upon that, my mother, I have a sibling group of 14. My mother could speak eloquently in our language, but didn't pass it to us for fear. When I hear Shannon talk about, even her mother in parenting her, my mother didn't pass that on to some of us for fear of what could happen to us. And so the other thing that I would like to pass on is, what would I encourage a social worker who is working with Indigenous individuals, aside from what my colleagues have already said? And one of the things I would add is attend some of those cultural events where appropriate. And I say where appropriate because some things are social, that whether that's the powwow that you can attend, some tribal nations may have more of that closed environment. So some of the pueblos in the Southwest, for example, when they have their feast days, those are exclusive. I wouldn't even be able to go to that unless I was invited in. So having an awareness of what some of that is, knowing that there's many tribal nations, and they all have some of those different requirements, but that consistency of being able to know that I care, I want to understand, I want to be that ally to know how I am able to provide the best for that whole family I'm serving.
So I think for me, I want to answer that from 2 different points of view. I want to answer that as a teenager who entered into foster care. What would I want a social worker to know before they were working with me or my family? And I think one is, once I went into foster care, I'm going to age myself, it was like in the early 90s, late 80s. It wasn't involved, but I never saw my family again. I just went from, visiting family and going to powwows and being involved in, traditional practices in my home, such as smudging and praying with tobacco, to absolutely nothing, and moving from foster home to foster home to foster home. And I felt like, I don't even think I knew who the investigator was more than I knew who my social worker was, because he had investigated my house so many times. But they never got to know who I was, never got to understand what was important, and never fought for me to see any of my family members. And I recently spoke in North Dakota, and that's where my case was opened in North Dakota. And somebody had come up who was a social worker back in those days, and they said, you know, they were taught that in order for your family to move along, to just not, advocate for visitation, because it would just hold me back, or, make things harder. And I feel like we've moved far from that, but we're still way behind, right? So I think we can do a better job at advocating for family visits, finding out who those kids love and who they want to see and who they want to keep in their life, finding out what's important to them. Like, are they dancers? What type of dancing do they do? Do they need help with regalia? Do they have family members that make them regalia that could be missing doing that for them? And then answering as an adult to have their children placed in foster care. Before somebody met me, I would really want them to come to me with where I was, and with an open mind, without, I mean, I guess it would be hard to come without judgment, but for my case, I was so judged that even when I was doing right, it was just never was good enough, right? And I was very fortunate to have my tribe be involved this time in my life, being involved in the system. And the difference that that made for visitation, making sure my kids saw each other, made sure that I did, made sure extended family members got to see, and just having my tribe at the table to support me was so huge, right? My social worker didn't support me. She didn't put anything that I asked for help for. She's like, you got to figure it out. You got to figure it out yourself. You got to figure it out yourself, which was really hard. But fortunately enough, we had a great tribal liaison in Minnesota who really helped me reconnect with family and reconnect with my culture, and hooked me up with elders in the community just to go sit and talk, to make sure that my case was culturally appropriate, and just to make sure that I have the things that I need, because they say that like being on assistance is supposed to be a stepping stone, but it's actually just a barrier to getting on your feet, because you can't ever get out of that cycle. So if I didn't have the Native American housing that I had, the Native American tribal worker, and the workers that were around me, I would not be where I was today. And I feel like it's because that social worker never got to know me, didn't believe in me, and didn't take anything that I needed or my kids needed into account. Fortunately, my tribe did. And, I feel like it's sometimes, I feel like a lot of times I see that tribes are the kind of the deciding vote for things in case plans. And the fact that my tribe got to know me, and I grew up in foster care, so I wasn't a part of like my reservation for quite some time, and didn't judge me and supported me as a mom to my kids, and supported me going to powwows and having those interactions with my kids within while they were in out of home placement was huge. And it definitely was something that helps me heal, because I truly believe, as an Indigenous person, in order for myself to heal, or for people, my people to heal, we have to come back to our culture, and we have to come back to our traditions. I think that is one of the key points to healing. So for a social worker to know what that is, to me, is really important, and to understand and to advocate for that.
I think if I can just add one really quick thing. It reminded me, an elder recently told me, don't celebrate how much you do know, lean into how much you don't know. And I think like that's really important as you just approach this work.
And yeah, you touched on a little bit of cultural humility, Shannon. Some of the things that we talk about in the classroom, and I guess just given the scenarios that you presented and talked about, what's the best way for social workers to just throughout the entire helping process incorporate you as an individual in your traditions, your beliefs and your values? What's the best way that we can incorporate that into that intervention and work with Native American families or Indigenous families? And I know, Shana, you touched on the bit, you gave a comparison of a social worker that was totally involved, totally immersed, and one that was not, and produced different outcomes. So as social workers, what are some of the things we can do specifically to ensure those desired and positive outcomes of what we result?
I'm going to jump in. So for 3 years, I was a guest, a lecturer, I guess, not a professor, at the University of Southern California School of Social Work. And I left that because most of the social workers were first years. And by the time I was done with them, they didn't want to be in social work anymore. So, but the truth is that we explored understanding our own bias. We explored really being awake about how perceptions are within our own minds, right? How we were raised, how having a father or didn't have a father, having mother or didn't have a mother. How does this influence your navigating today as a social worker? I think often most of the social workers I work with would say, I want to just help families. I want to be here to help families. And that's a good thing in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of perception that goes into that as well. What do families really need? Do they really need your help? And what does that look like? Are you prescribing what you think they need, or are you listening and hearing what it is that they need to be successful, right? So I think that understanding our own bias, understanding where we're coming from, also understanding the privilege with every family that you're dealing with. But when you're dealing with Indigenous folks and understanding the trauma and just really exercising knowing who you are before you get there, I often do a lot of work in domestic violence, and I've supported a lot of victims of domestic violence. I'm a survivor myself. And I remember when I transitioned and started working with fathers in particularly, there was one father that I did not recognize until it was well into his case that I had a bias to. And when I really finally sat down and looked at what it was that bothered me, I saw him as a previous perpetrator that had come into my life that I had advocated against. And so I had to really step back and recognize that I needed to step away from that case. I needed to support in a different way. What did that look like for me? I fortunately was in a place where I had staff that I worked with that I was able to say, I think you're going to be a better fit, and here's how I can support you as you work through this. And that case was successful. And I really do think that it was trial and error on my own part to really walk my talk and recognize that I sometimes have biases. And when I do, it does impact the work that I do. When you're stepping into tribes, there's a lot of bias that sometimes we don't even recognize we have. So I think that's a good place to start.
Thank you, Michael. Did either one of you wanted to respond to that? Or just add to it? Okay, we'll move on because we only have about 15 minutes, folks. Could you believe it? But there's at the macro level, I know there are a lot of systemic structural barriers that prevent access to those resources, maybe in healthcare, education, that exist. As a social worker, what can we do as social workers to help remove some of those systemic barriers and structural barriers that seem to be obstacles and roadblocks for Native American and Indigenous families? What can we do in our role at the micro level? Then I have a macro question I want to ask too. All of that in 15 minutes.
Yeah. I would say on the micro level, one of the things that I think we at the Law Center that we're really hopeful that we can do is walk with someone as they navigate a process. So one of the things that we have struggled with in Minnesota is access to chemical health programs, and they exist everywhere in Minnesota. We're like the land of like 10,000 treatment programs, right? Like it is a place where treatment programs are there's a lot of them, but the reality of someone who, and to give you some context, at the Law Center, everyone that we are working with is struggling with economic security or insecurity, right? So we're working with people who do not have a lot of financial resources or a lot of resources in general. So navigating that space and recognizing what it's like to sit in a room for 3 hours waiting, or making multiple calls and getting not able to access a live person. So places or resources that are out there, right? We have a list of resources, but then the actual practical implications of trying to navigate that space. So I think as social workers, and something, I mean, Shana can talk about kind of the practical piece of this, but sometimes sitting with someone for a day and walking with them as they navigate the process. And I understand that that can be really labor intensive or resource intensive on a social work, but that feeling of having someone else be with you and understand kind of how difficult it is, or how difficult it can be to navigate transportation, because some of the treatment centers are outside the metro area. And how do you get from, where we're at, that's very centrally located, to somewhere that is further out, with public transportation that right now by many isn't perceived to be safe. And so kind of walking the walk and actually the practical, I think on a very individual basis, can have a profound impact. And spending that time gives a greater understanding of what families are experiencing, but also I think helps to develop strong trust in being able to see what someone is going through on a day to day. So it's not just enough to get a referral, right? Like say, hey, you call this number and here you go, but actually sitting with that person and like from an ICWA language, I mean, that's really active efforts. So it's really that unique response to the individual's needs, and helping them walk through, I think, can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I want to add to that. Thank you for that, Shannon, because a lot of times what I see is the availability, acceptability, and accessibility for resources is extremely challenging, whether we are within our urban settings or within our tribal nations. And for me in particular, I live within my tribal nation. Having accessibility to a lot of the resources that are needed for that overall wellness and well-being, they're miles away. And yet we are expecting individuals to get to those. So I really like being able to be there, to really be that support system. We're not sitting there in that environment where we're enabling, we're having that personal relationship. Now I know sometimes academia is going to go, oh my gosh, where's our boundary? You can still establish that and know what that is. So for myself, what I really work with when I have an intern that I've worked with, and really trying to bring together what does it look like from that westernized model to how do we have when we know that there's distrust for systems, that there's uncertainty. I already come into this with maybe some biases that, everything is just not going to work out. Don't leave it to that individual. And when I talk about those, being able to have those conversations, those courageous conversations as the topic of this, and I always say, SAMHSA developed this 8 dimensions of wellness. So if you need a starting point to have some conversations with who we're working with, talk about those things. What does economic security look like for your household? What is coming into your household? What are you doing for some of that spirituality? And if I say spirituality, then for me, it opens it up to, we can not only talk about what might be there for Indigenous, and then it could just build upon those conversations so I can have a better understanding as whether I'm there as that social worker, I'm there as that peer person, I'm there as that relative helping somebody, and really pulling in, how do I bring in relatives to help support that as well too. And again, think of relative in that broader sense, not defined by blood. What does that look like? And maybe that relative, and using that terminology, is another system as well. But if I can take away some of that naming and really put it all on that same level, that we're here for that holistic wellness and that holistic well-being for all of us as just individuals.
I want to add to that by saying that it's important that social workers lean into the Indigenous community. I know in Minnesota, we have so much Native American programming that would be wonderful for families to partake in. Even kids who are in foster care, there's so many things for youth to do. And start building those relationships with those community agencies, because there's going to be a day that you're going to step back, but those community agencies and those especially Indigenous ones are there to just kind of wrap our relatives in care, right? And they're able to stay open and they're able to provide that support. I don't think the system is a very supportive system, but when that system is no longer there, that they have a pathway to stay out of the system.
All right, thank you. We only have about 10 minutes, but there's one macro question. You know, we're all aware that we're having a new administration moving in into the White House come January. Sometime in January, late January, I think it's January 20th, if I'm not mistaken. We're going to have that transition. So what would governments and just corporations, any of us, what at that level, what can they do to help just preserve who you are and respect tribal sovereignty and your lands and everything else? What can government do to protect and preserve who you are as a people?
I think one thing is important to know is that tribal sovereignty existed before the Constitution. And the tribes as sovereign nations, the relationship that tribal nations have with the federal government is a government to government relationship. It's a unique relationship. It is a relationship that is built on promises that has often been plagued by broken promises, but certainly the sense of the federal government has been a promise that to protect the future of tribes as sovereign nations, and that there is that unique relationship between tribes and the government that is something that exists beyond any administration and should continue to exist beyond any administration. And so I think that recognition of tribal sovereignty is a unique relationship of tribal people to their government and to their tribal nations is something that's unique and needs to be protected, and something that has value in regards to the future of tribal communities. So, recognizing that and honoring that, I believe, is what absolutely should happen. There's fear, right? There's fear that that many of the systems that have been set forth to be things that, social ideas of like education and adoption have been historically turned on their face and become a sword to destroy tribal communities. And so I think that's the fear. Like, will child welfare, will there be threats or challenges to ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that really protects Indian children's connection to their tribe and really protects the future of tribes, if that will be threatened and used in a way to erode tribal sovereignty. And so I think there's fears. I think the hope lies and the strength lies in the fact that tribal nations are sovereign nations, and one administration or an administration should not be able to take away that promise that has existed pre-Constitution.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to close out. But what I'm wanting to know, there were plenty of questions that we had. We only have an hour's time, which, we anticipated, we'll be done in 1 hour, but it's obvious that we need more time. So what I would like to close out with is to ask each and every one of you, can just go, again, round robin. What are some absolutely do's and don'ts when working with Native American families and Indigenous people? What are some of the do's and don'ts? Just if you can share with us 1 or 2 each, or, that would be great. But we don't have much time. We have about 6 minutes. What are some absolutely do's and don'ts? Do's and don'ts. Don't do this, do this. Or do this and don't do that.
I'll go first. Don't call the foster parents mom and dad. And my do is try to keep cultural identity intact by all means possible. And even if that means thinking outside of the box, if we're doing visitation at powwows, if you're thinking about maybe getting a sewing machine for mom so she continue making regalia, or beading kits, or letting the kids and I mean, we have so many different programs here, just to make moccasins for newborns, if you're able to do that for visitation as opposed to sitting in a room with somebody in there. So just whatever you can do to think outside of the box is what I would say.
All right. Chepa.
Yeah, I wanted to build upon that, and the first thought that went through my mind is knowing that it's important, and do the creating of the allyships. So you can create the space where you are able to work with families on a large context. And when I say that, I mean that, again, knowing that many of our families live in with other family members, multi-generational families that live together. And so what is it that we can do to offer support across all? While I might only be working with one family, what can I do to support that? And my other do that I would say is, again, creating that space where you can bring together individuals, whether it's, as Shannon was talking about, creating that space where I'm bringing people together to help with regalia making. I'm bringing people together to help learn about more of our traditional foods, our plants, our medicines. What does some of that look like? So we have an idea of, what are those supports that will sustain us long term. And my don't list could go on forever. And I really want to stay in the lens of, as a social worker who is really built from that strengths-based perspective.
Awesome. Shannon?
I would just echo what has already been said. I think they're awesome suggestions. And I think, leaning into authenticity, leaning into questions, leaning into learning about someone's unique values is the do's, and that's really coming from a strength-based perspective. So I agree with everything that's being said, and I will pass it on to Michael.
I would just say, don't confuse poverty for neglect or abuse. Check your bias, and then do listen to learn.
All right. Thank you. We've had this has been very enlightening and educational. There were some suggestions in the chat. I know Dr. Thayer, you want to just comment to the group? It's in the chat and his suggestion.
Well, thank you, Keithan. As a privileged white guy, there's no way in God's green earth I could ever possibly become culturally competent in the indigenous people's different cultures. I just can't do it. And even though I'm in my 70s, I can't see a 20, 30-year-old white person doing this either. I think we should have more initiatives to recruit Native peoples to come and get their social work degrees and go back in their community, just like we've done with Title IV, to train child welfare workers who are going to work in child welfare.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Thayer. Good suggestion. Allison, did you want to comment on anything before we close out? Allison Solon had a couple of questions.
Hi, nice to meet you all. This is a really great discussion. I learned a lot. So I'm a pre-law student, and I've really been in the mindset of how can I drive my social work values and skills that I've been learning in classes, like listening techniques, how to interview people to really receive what their needs are. What ways do you feel like as a college student now I can like kind of gear my questions and like my perspective in class to challenge the system a bit more and like be more keen to like recognize discrimination or like ways in which policies negatively affect people?
I can comment just a little bit on that. I think, and I welcome you reaching out. I appreciate the legal perspective, and I think it is an awesome awesome connection. I feel like on a day-to-day basis, I use what I learned as a social worker every day, right? But then what I kind of lean into in the courtroom is the legal education, right? And so I think they absolutely come together. I think the social work perspective of how you approach people in a strength-based perspective, how you understand, how you listen, I think is the piece that keeps me going every single day. The policy and the legal piece is awesome in a sense of how to respond at times and how to respond to the individual, but then also respond in regards to policy. So I would just keep asking the questions, keep learning. But certainly if you want to kind of see how it all comes together, you are welcome to reach out anytime. But I think it's an amazing connection, and I feel very fortunate to be able to really have that perspective of, I mean, I love working. My favorite part of my work, I will say, is the conversations I have with the individuals I'm representing. And I think that that's my favorite part, not because of so much the legal framework, but it's because of the connections and the relationships. And then the legal piece becomes something that hopefully I can use as a tool to help move forward and help them create a path forward while elevating their voices. So I think it's a great combination, and awesome to have you here today.
Thank you. I think that pathway is really important. I think building those relationships is so important, but then having the policy to back up what you do with those relationships, like being able to support people in a physical material sense as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
All righty. Well, I just would like to, it's 2:31 and I wanted to be a man of my word, and we were going for an hour. Although it's not enough time, I really, really wanted to take this opportunity just to express a heartfelt thank you and gracious thank you for all of you for being here. The presenters, Ms. Shana King, Chepa, Shannon Smith, and Michael Huesca. Thank you so much. Thank you all for showing up.